John, Mouin? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, as everyone can see, hello and welcome to a live stream, first ever, of Radio Warnerd. I'm the host, Mark Ames. I'm here in Western New York. We have the Warner, John Dolan, aka Gary Betcher, in Southern Italy. And with us, our honored guest today, we're very honored to have with them Mouin Rabbani is joining us to talk about the Gaza war and Hamas and Israel. And I actually was first. I now realize I've read Mouin's stuff in the past, but I really was stricken by an interview that he did with Norman Finkelstein on the day that we all learned about the Hamas attack on October 7th. And so I've been trying to track him down and find out how we can get him on the show, because I know that our subscribers be very happy to hear and want to hear and need to hear Mouin's thoughts on everything. And it's really just a mind-blowing time. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show and welcome, Mouin.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Just a quick introduction for Mouin. He's Palestinian, born in the Netherlands, did his higher education in the U.S. at Tufts and Georgetown. He's currently the co-editor of Jadalia and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. And he's publishing articles all the time, and has published a few really good you should read pieces. We'll post links to them even just since the war started. I mean, maybe we can even just start with a couple of your articles, like one of your more recent ones, which is something people are not looking at. I mean, we're going to want to get into background and everything, but let's also, I think, talk a little bit about current stuff. You have this great article on how the U.S. is not only sort of throwing, full-throated support behind Israel and making their war ours and providing them everything they need, but beneath it all, it belies a real lack of confidence in Israel's political leadership, its military leadership, and in particularly its military and intelligence capabilities. Can you talk about this?
Yes, well, I think by way of background, it's useful to recall that relations between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government have been strained for some time. This had mainly to do with Israel's the government's legislative agenda for the judiciary to give the prime minister virtually autocratic powers, and much less to do with anything concerning the Palestinians. And the second issue is, of course, that the Biden administration's main diplomatic initiative in the region has been to try to forge a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And this was encountering a number of obstacles from members of the current Israeli governing coalition as well. And against that background, the attacks into Israel of 7 October took place. And the Israeli military and intelligence services, which have cultivated quite successfully, I think, an image of omnipotence, of omniscience, particularly in Washington, this military collapsed like a house of cards. And the problem with its intelligence services was not that they failed to heed adequate warning, but they literally had no information about what was about to hit them, despite constantly bragging about how they're in full control of the situation. One result is that the Israeli political, as well as military, as well as intelligence leadership has been in total disarray since the 7th of October. They have there's been a lot of bluster and we're going to eradicate this and kill that and conquer this and so on. But they haven't really laid out clear, attainable objectives, nor to date do they appear to have made particularly significant progress in achieving that. And against this background, we've seen the US not only offer rock solid support to Israel in military and political and diplomatic terms, but we've seen the United States increasingly participating in Israeli decision making, and I would argue even taking over significant parts of the Israeli decision making progress. So you have, for example, First Secretary of State Antony Blinken and then President Biden physically participating in emergency cabinet meetings of the Israeli government, participating, leading the discussions that we can discuss. But quite clearly, the Americans are sending a message to the Israelis of not only did you collapse like a house of cards on the 7th of October, but we're not going to let you inflict yet another fiasco on yourselves in this war on the Gaza Strip, because it's not only going to damage you, it's going to damage the US. And it's against this background, I think, that we're seeing the active participation of the United States in the Israeli decision-making process. And another element of this is, if you go back to the Reagan administration, and this is a characterization that has been very broadly accepted among the US political and security elite, was a description of Israel as the unsinkable US aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. In other words, that it was this rock solid outpost promoting US interests in the Middle East. Well, now look at the reality. Israel is more akin to a leaky trawler that has had to be shored up by the US, sending not one, but two aircraft carrier groups to the Eastern Mediterranean. And one last point I would make here is, when you have this image of being omnipotent, of being omniscient, of being a know-it-all and being able to do whatever you want to do against any opposition, and then you have the kinds of fiascos that we've seen during the past month, to the extent that the US has to actively participate in shoring you up. That, I think, is going to have long-term consequences for Israel's position in US political, military, and intelligence circles.
Yeah, good points. Just to talk about Hamas's military prowess real quickly. I mean, that's an amazing thing you said, that Israeli intelligence had actually no ears, or had no intelligence about this happening. I think I saw somewhere, it was maybe even Israeli intelligence person or ex-intelligence said something like, they have no good human intelligence in Gaza anymore, because if you have sources who you have blackmail over, they're not that reliable. They're not that good. The best human intelligence sources are people who have some ideological reason, whether it's a personal vendetta or a factional vendetta, and that they can't find that in Gaza. And then, of course, you add on top of it the Israelis, and particularly today's Israelis, arrogance towards Hamas and completely dismissing them as a force that could have done something like this. It's pretty mind-blowing. Yeah.
Yes, well, the events of October 7th, initially at least, were often compared to the events 50 years earlier, when Egypt and Syria jointly launched the October War. But I think there are important differences. While it's true that Egypt and Syria went to great lengths to conceal their preparations and intentions in order to launch a surprise attack on the 6th of October, 1973, it is also true that Israel received repeated warnings that it was about to be attacked from, among others, King Hussein of Jordan, who called an urgent meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir and clearly explained to her that Israel was about to be attacked. From Ashraf Marwan, who was an extremely highly placed Egyptian, who was actually the previous Egyptian president, Jamal Abdel Nasser's son-in-law, but had turned into an Israeli intelligence asset and warned them. And there were even several Israeli intelligence analysts who had concluded that something big was about to happen. But there clearly was a case of Israeli hubris and arrogance and an outright refusal to believe that Israel's enemies would dare to attack it. And we all know what happened next. Here, I think the situation is quite different. You mentioned human sources. That's certainly part of the equation. But more importantly, I think we need to understand that the Gaza Strip is an extremely small territory. It's something along the lines of 350 square kilometers. It's also the most intensively surveyed patch of land on the planet, more than anything in North Korea or China or the United States or anywhere else. Israel is in effect in control of all electronic and digital communications in the Gaza Strip. If you send a text message or a social media post or make a phone call, it's basically routed through Israel before it reaches its intended recipient. In addition to that, there is very intensive electronic surveillance around the boundary separating the Gaza Strip for Israel from Israel. There are drones covering every square millimeter of the Gaza Strip 24/7, 365 days a year. And this gave Israel the confidence that it knew exactly what was going on and had a very accurate reading of not only the capabilities, but also the intentions of those it controlled in this way. And it's clear that Hamas in recent years has very much improved its intelligence and particularly its counterintelligence capabilities. It reverted back to, let's say, very traditional methods of communication. Some of your listeners may be old enough to remember pen and paper. And physical meetings, and then also appears to have used those communications that Israel was monitoring to send out false messages. I do think that Israel had human resources within the Gaza Strip simply because an Israeli permit is required for virtually everything for anyone who needs to leave the Gaza Strip. But it seems that not only did Hamas counterintelligence manage to a very significant degree to neutralize this threat, but also to use those sources to feed false information to the Israelis, and also to use Palestinians who did, and here I'm speculating, but it sounds like a reasonable conclusion, to also use Palestinians who did gain entry into Israel, for example, as agricultural or construction workers, to conduct various forms of reconnaissance for the organization. Israel has a euphemism, and it's called mowing the lawn. And what that means is that every few years it comes in with its air force and its artillery and so on, and conducts an onslaught in the Gaza Strip to reduce Hamas's military capabilities and to reduce the potential threat to Israel from the Gaza Strip. And it's quite staggering that given this level of control, given that the Gaza Strip has been under a hermetic Israeli-Egyptian blockade since the early 2000s, that right under Israel's noses, Hamas actually managed to construct a thriving rainforest, while Israel was under the impression it was keeping the lawn nicely manicured.
Yeah, it's the most extraordinary achievement in surprise that I can recall from the last 50 years of warfare. And I mean, from the beginning, I've been wondering about this. I mean, what an extraordinary thing. It seems to me it's been underreported. And when you compare it to the war in Sinai 50 years ago, there you can tell, okay, yeah, you can't move tank armies, even if the satellites of 50 years ago were far more primitive than those today. You can't move tank armies without being spotted. But after years of having the grass mowed, to use their own grisly metaphor, and maybe Hamas has learned to go underground, literally, has adapted that with the miniaturization of weapons. And when you saw them zooming through the broken fence of Gaza, what you saw was motorcycles, rifles, and various grenade launchers. And those things can all be stored underground. So, and maybe even more
interrupt you, but
yeah.
Motorcycles you can store above ground.
Yeah, right. Because you're just getting to work or whatever. But yeah, so nothing, it was either civilian technology like motorcycles, or it was something that's small enough that it could be hidden away from the lawnmower.
Yes, and here I just to expand a little further on your comparison with the 1973 October War. In 1973, in addition to hubris, Israel was imprisoned by one of its own analytical conclusions, which stated that the Arabs and the Egyptian military in particular would not consider launching an attack across the Suez Canal into the occupied Sinai Peninsula unless and until it acquired certain state-of-the-art weaponry from the Soviet Union. And given that it had not yet received this weaponry, the Israelis proved to be simply incapable of believing that the Egyptians would launch their offensive without first obtaining it. What has happened here is that Israel made a similar analytical strategic error, which is that it reached the conclusion, Hamas seized power in the Gaza Strip in 2007. It has been ruling the Gaza Strip since then. It's the only territory that Hamas administers, and the Gaza Strip has in effect become the headquarters of Hamas. And Israeli military intelligence and other intelligence services and the political leadership concluded that maintaining its rule over the Gaza Strip and prolonging its governance of that territory was so central to Hamas that it would not undertake any initiatives that could potentially endanger that. And that led them subsequently to dismiss anything Hamas said about, for example, protecting the sanctity of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, about seeking freedom for the thousands of Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails and so on. They dismissed this as kind of rhetoric, polemics that were being presented by Hamas to distract Palestinian public opinion from their real mission in life, which was to maintain their rule and, in certain respects, their increasingly unpopular rule over the Gaza Strip.
And it also seems that the Israeli government was distracted with a project in the West Bank, which I never quite understood. Even then, I thought it's not orthodox counterintelligence to let random settlers torment people without a purpose, but maybe there was a purpose in that, and it set off a reaction in the wrong place. Maybe there was something to be arranged in the West Bank, but not Gaza.
Well, I would start by pointing out that it's unclear to what extent Israel did divert resources, and particularly manpower, to the West Bank. And the reason I say this is because Israel has in recent years constructed a $1 billion plus electronic border around the Gaza Strip with sensors, automated machine guns, drones, cameras, and so on. And it did this, given the changing nature of its military and society more broadly. It did this with the view that it could reduce the number of soldiers required on active duty to patrol this boundary. And I don't think it did that for the express purpose of diverting military forces to the West Bank. I think this was part of a more, let's say, general, quote unquote, modernization of the Israeli military and of its blockade of the Gaza Strip. Now, regarding the West Bank, I think we need to recall that one key reason that Israel conducted what it called its unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005 was, first of all, to introduce Israeli unilateralism rather than Israeli-Palestinian agreement as the foundational principle for resolving Israeli-Palestinian issues. And secondly, just as it withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula in 1979, in large part to have the freedom to intensify its settlement enterprise in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, in 2005, it disengaged from the Gaza Strip for a number of reasons, but one important reason was to have a freer hand to intensify Israeli colonization in the West Bank. And I think as part of that process, it's important to see the settler movement and settler militias not as something that operates independently from, or even in any way in opposition to, the Israeli state or the Israeli military, but I think it should be properly viewed and understood as an auxiliary militia of the Israeli state, promoting its agenda of eventual full formal annexation of the West Bank.
You made a great point in your, I mean, one of many, in your discussion with Norman Finkelstein on October 7th, when you guys were first reacting, that the October 7th attack was basically presaged by the 2021 conflict in Gaza, Israel and Gaza, which was different from previous conflicts with Hamas / Gaza in a number of ways. Could you explain that again too? Because I thought it was a really important point.
Yes, well, if we look at previous Israeli offensives against the Gaza Strip, certainly the main ones, 2008, 2012, 2014, were all initiated by Israel. And they had very much to do with the situation in the Gaza Strip rather than broader issues. What happened in 2018 with the Great March of Return is that Palestinians, it wasn't so much a Hamas initiative as more of a Palestinian popular initiative that was eventually endorsed by Hamas, launched the Great March of Return. Hundreds were killed and wounded. And in the end, nothing changed in terms of the continuation of the blockade and all the rest of it. 2021, I think, was even more significant because that was the first time in these confrontations that it was, not only was it initiated by Hamas rather than by Israel, but it was initiated by Hamas for reasons that had nothing to do with the Gaza Strip. Mm-hmm. It was a response to growing Israeli encroachment on the Haram al-Sharif, the compound that encloses the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock Mosque in the old city of East Jerusalem, and the intensification of Israeli settlement activity in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem. And this was quite significant, I think. But nevertheless, after the end of that confrontation, which was referred to by the Palestinians as the Unity Intifada or Unity Uprising, because Palestinians during those weeks managed to overcome their growing fragmentation, geographical and political fragmentation. You had a simultaneous uprising, if you will, by Palestinians in the West Bank, mm-hmm. within Israel, in the Gaza Strip, and increasingly also in surrounding Arab countries. It also didn't change anything. And against that background, I think that Hamas decided that it needed to do something, let's say, genuinely spectacular, if it wanted to irrevocably shatter the status quo, a status quo that was increasingly characterized by intensified Israeli unilateralism in seeking to resolve the Palestine question exclusively on its own terms, and now led by the most extremist government in Israeli history. This, I think, is the general background to the attacks of October 7th.
Okay, so that answers. Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering about this. I mean, we've studied a lot of insurgencies, and a lot of them stage a first attack that is not meant to be, well, or that is unlikely to be a military strategic success. So did Hamas basically resign itself to the loss of most of the Hamas troops who crossed into Israel?
I think there's a lot of unanswered questions about these kinds of details. The Israelis are claiming that 1,500 or so Hamas militants crossed into Israel, and that virtually all of them were killed or captured in the subsequent days. There are other reports that, in fact, a very large proportion of those Hamas militants carried out their attacks and operations and subsequently managed to successfully return to the Gaza Strip. So I don't think we have enough information to make a clear determination one way or the other. I think we can state with certainty that, well over 1,000 Hamas infiltrate and from other groups, and later also ordinary Palestinians infiltrated into Israel, that many were killed. And it also seems that many were able to return to the Gaza Strip. Certainly, if you have a figure of something along the lines of 250 captives and hostages, well, they didn't just walk into.
No, somebody had to escort them back to Gaza. Yes, so clearly some of them did return, which is also really extraordinary and highlights the failure of what, when I was young, a long time ago, was often referred to as the finest military in the world, or finest military pound for pound in the world.
Well, sorry.
No, go, please.
Well, a British journalist, friend of mine, once characterized the Israeli military as first world weapons, second world army, third world enemies. And, this is obviously a simplification, but I think does reveal an important reality about not only the Israeli military, but also the environment it has generally operated in. What we've seen in recent years is that the Israeli military is a quite effective killing machine, but an increasingly less serious fighting force, particularly when it comes to ground operations. In 2014, it ran into huge problems when it launched a ground invasion of a, at the time, much weaker Gaza Strip. In 2006, it was practically eaten alive when it launched a ground invasion of southern Lebanon in the final days of that conflict. And perhaps most tellingly, during the past year, the Israeli army has repeatedly tried to eliminate a growing phenomenon of essentially very poorly armed ragtag militias in the northern West Bank, in Jenin and Nablus and their surroundings. And it's still ongoing. They still haven't been able to wipe these groups out. But I think also we have to recognize another component, which is that Hamas, I mean, it's not an army by any stretch of the imagination. It is still, I think, a force of limited resources and limited capabilities and so on. But they do appear to have a pretty good learning curve, in the sense that if you look at what happened on October 7th, they seem to have planned well to first blind the Israeli military by taking out, for example, the electronic sensors, disabling the automated machine guns, and so on, before going through the fence, then launching their initial attacks at Israeli military bases that would have been responsible for communications with headquarters to call in reinforcements, and so on. Then carting off all kinds of intelligence folders and files that they were able to get their hands on. So they did, at least in the initial phases, successfully blind the Israeli military and successfully reduce its ability to mobilize for a counterattack.
I'm thinking about those files they were able to take away. I'd be really interested in knowing what was in there. Was it about Israeli plans? Is it about their intelligence assets? Is it about, how to access their deeper files? I mean,
well, it's unclear, of course, and the Israelis, I don't think, are going to be transparent.
No,
what was taken, but what we do know is, for example, the Erez crossing, which is the main crossing point for humans between the Gaza Strip and Israel. That's kind of the headquarters where Palestinians are recruited for collaboration with the Israeli authorities, and so the personal files of all these people would have been there. There have also been reports that the Hamas forces managed to enter the headquarters of Unit 8200.
Wow.
And Unit 8200 is Israel's state-of-the-art signals intelligence or electronic intelligence unit, and was described is described as one of the jewels in the crown of the Israeli state, which raises a question of how much hubris would you need to keep it within spitting distance.
It's amazing.
I remember an article just about a month before Hamas struck, which was glowing report about how many graduates of Force 8200 had become CEOs and
Yeah,
Silicon Valley
it's like
stars.
a Wharton for Silicon,
Yeah.
for
Yes.
um
But they
so
didn't
yeah,
have
go
the
ahead.
foresight to
Yeah.
locate their headquarters in a more secure
Yeah.
location.
Yeah. um Getting back to Hamas's strategy, I mean, you've laid out their strategy, but I think it's, in everybody's mind, you wonder a couple of things. Number one, did Hamas expect to be as successful, do you think, as they were? Number two, did they expect to kill as many people as they killed and kidnap as many as they were able to take prisoner? And number three, do you think they anticipated the absolute savagery of the Israeli response so far, and the full-throated U.S. backing? I mean, the news statistic today that came out, I think it's up to 10,000 dead, which is already more civilians killed by Israel in 30 days than Russia, which is supposedly the most evil, barbaric war since Hitler. More than Russia has killed in 600 days of war on a population 20 times larger than Gaza. So, I mean, the savagery of the response is also, I just wonder how much you think they might have anticipated, or if you're able to glean any of that, the success, the scale, and the scale of the response.
Well, I think we're not in a position yet to give definitive answers to these questions.
Mm-hmm.
What I will say is that I do remain convinced that a key objective of Hamas on October 7th was to shatter the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
The unanswered question for me is, did they intend to do this with a more limited operation in which they plan to infiltrate the border, kill a number of soldiers, capture a number of soldiers, bring them back into the Gaza Strip, and start negotiating a prisoner exchange? Or did they genuinely intend to carry out, this kind of, let's call it, attack of strategic significance? In either case, what we do know is that on October 7th, the Israeli military collapsed like a house of cards at the first contact. And that suggests to me that regardless of Hamas's initial ambitions, what we ended up seeing was almost certainly of significantly larger scope and scale than either what Hamas intended to achieve or its expectations. I think the main thrust of their attack was to damage the Gaza division, which is the division of the Israeli military responsible for keeping Israeli control over the Gaza Strip. It's also clear by now that a large number of Israeli non-combatants were killed on October 7th. And here I think it's very difficult to give firm conclusions. I think we can state with a fair level of confidence that atrocities were committed. It's less clear whether these were in line with planning and orders, whether these were perhaps atrocities committed on the individual initiative of certain units who decided, let's say, they were going to go out with a bang and exact revenge for being treated the way we're now seeing Israel pounding the Gaza Strip and the siege and all the rest of it. Whether perhaps these were carried out by ordinary Palestinians who rushed into Israeli population centers once the border had been breached. To what extent were these civilians killed in subsequent crossfire as Israeli forces eventually came to reconquer these population centers and basically started fighting and shelling as if they were dealing with a Palestinian population center rather than their own. To what extent can we ascribe these deaths to what is known as a Hannibal directive, which is an Israeli part of Israeli military doctrine, which says that a dead Israeli captive is preferable to a live one. So I think these are, Israel has sought to present the events of October 7th as a premeditated massacre whose sole purpose was to kill as many Israeli civilians as possible. I would argue that the main objective on October 7th was to hit the Israeli military and intelligence, and to hit them hard, because Hamas understands very clearly that if it wanted to shatter the status quo, it would have to strike hard and successfully at military targets, or it would fail. Having said that, I think, yes, large numbers of non-combatants were also killed. It seems to me we're able to conclude also that atrocities were committed. And I think we should have further examination of the circumstances of these atrocities to get a better understanding to what extent they were part of an operational plan, if you will, and to what extent other factors may account for them.
Yeah, this goes sort of hand in hand with this sort of PR campaign attempt to equate Hamas with Islamic State, with ISIS. And John and I have done a couple episodes sort of trying to give some context to what Hamas, what they grew out of, Muslim Brotherhood, yes. Nakba, occupation. It's a very different circumstances and older circumstances. But I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because they're not ISIS. I mean, just for one thing, for example, I don't ever remember ISIS releasing hostages or prisoners as a goodwill gesture. That was that was not their thing,
Well, it's not just ISIS. I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the attacks of 7 October, when, as I mentioned, there was an effort to present these as kind of a premeditated massacre of
Jews,
unarmed civilians, and as you said, of Jews and nothing else. And you had President Biden claiming to have seen images of Palestinians beheading infants and so on, and it wasn't just ISIS. I mean, Hamas was compared to Nazis, to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, and I think the purpose of these polemics was to basically say that these people do not have and cannot have any legitimate agenda behind their actions. More importantly, there is no relevant political or historical context. History started today, and not a moment before, and they were motivated purely by hatred and the desire to kill and murder and maim. And the driving force behind their agenda is Jew hatred and the desire to kill Jews. And therefore, if you want to properly understand what happened in October 7th, your terms of reference should be the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, or ISIS, but don't you dare look at Gaza and Israeli-Palestinian relations for an explanation of what's happening. Now, regarding the relationship between Hamas and ISIS, I would start by saying that these two organizations come out of very different traditions. I mean, to say, they're both Islamist organizations would be the equivalent of saying that the German Social Democrats and the German National Socialists are identical because they're both
Socialist.
German, you know,
or German, yeah.
or socialists or whatever.
Yeah.
So, you know, Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a regional organization. You can kind of think of it in a way like the communist movement of old, which has national chapters in various countries, and it's kind of in that respect organizationally similar. And Hamas Hamas was only established in the late 1980s. The Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, which previously operated, without getting into the history, as a local branch of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza and a local branch of the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood in the West Bank, had a agenda of, let's call it, promoting religiosity and political quiescence. In other words, throughout the 70s and much of the 80s, they rejected direct confrontation with Israel and the Israeli occupation on the grounds that Palestinian society needs to be properly Islamized first in preparation for an eventual confrontation with Israel. And many Palestinians saw this as kind of a cop-out, and that this was kind of the rationale for not confronting Israel. So it functioned very much, let's say, as a social movement rather than as a political or paramilitary movement. Then
I think it was in Bacconi's book that he mentioned the resentment a lot of Palestinian militants felt dating back to the resistance to the British, that the Muslim Brotherhood always had some theological answer for why they couldn't participate in any of their actions.
Yes, although in fairness, there was a significant participation by Muslim brothers from various Arab countries during 1947, 1948, and some of these figures are still remembered among Palestinians to this day. But I think your general point is correct, and proof of this is that in the early 1980s, Islamic Jihad was actually formed by dissident members of the Muslim Brotherhood under the influence of the Islamic Revolution in Iran on the one hand, and jihadi groups that were at the time emerging in Egypt on the other, basically stating that they adopted a more revolutionary agenda, if you will, saying that the confrontation with Israel must take precedence over the social rules of the movement. And that's how Islamic Jihad was formed. And in December 1987, the Palestinian Intifada in the occupied territories erupted. And support, in effect, began to drain away from the Muslim Brotherhood movement, particularly among youth who wanted to participate in this mass mobilization against the Israeli occupation. And it's in that context that Hamas, that the Muslim Brotherhood, rather, in Palestine, took a decision to establish the Hamas movement. They claim that Hamas was established in December 1987. I think it would be more accurate to say that it emerged in February 1988, several months after the Intifada commenced. But be that as it may, in fact, that it was established under the name of Hamas rather than under the name of the Muslim Brotherhood also demonstrates, I think, the intention of the leadership. You know, you set up this organization. If it succeeds, you claim it as your own. If it fails, you can ascribe it to rogue elements or whatever, and claim it wasn't part of the organization.
Hotheads, the old. Those are just a bunch of hotheads.
Exactly. So, and it's a movement that, during the Intifada, you had what was called the Unified National Leadership of the Uprising, in which all the traditional factions that operated within the framework of the PLO operated, as well as Islamic Jihad, which was not part of the PLO, cooperated with the unified leadership. Hamas never did, and there was, in fact, quite significant rivalry in many areas between the unified leadership on the one hand and Hamas on the other. But I think, to get back to your question, and sorry for this.
No, it's really interesting. Yeah.
But then, Hamas's next big break, in effect, came with the 1993 Oslo agreements, where, although these enjoyed significant Palestinian popular support in the occupied territories initially, once their true face, if you will, began to be revealed, Hamas began to benefit from popular disillusion with it. And then you had the Second Intifada, and in 2006, Hamas participated in Palestinian legislative elections because it sought to translate its growing popular support into institutional power, and it wanted to exercise actual political power within Palestinian Authority institutions, even though formally it continued to reject the Oslo agreements. Now, getting to the point about ISIS, the scholar Cole Bunzel, who is best known for writing for a book that he recently wrote on Wahhabism and Saudi Arabia, and is no particular friend of Hamas by any stretch of the imagination, had a very interesting article in a recent issue of Foreign Affairs where he discusses this relationship. And he points to all the statements made by Islamic State denouncing Hamas as basically a bunch of infidels and apostates who need to be put to the sword because they carry out such outrageous measures as participating in democratic elections, and of seeking governance that is not exclusively based on Islamic law, and a whole host of other unforgivable sins that they have committed. That's very much at the ideological level. At the practical level, after Islamic State established its self-proclaimed caliphate in 2014, 2015, there was a group of Islamic State sympathizers in the Gaza Strip, particularly the Rafah region of the southern Gaza Strip, who tried to kind of set up a zone of Islamic State influence there. And they were very quickly dealt with severely by Hamas and basically wiped out. So I think, these two movements come from very different traditions. Anyone with any understanding of the contemporary Middle East would see, again, that lumping these together is like lumping the German Social Democrats and German National Socialists.
But the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, that I get the sense that's not a mythical connection. That's
no, and in some respects.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask. Maybe it's just because we're English language deafness victims, but why has there been silence from Egypt and silence from what under Morsi seemed to be the very powerful Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I think the main reason is that the Sisi regime in Egypt since 2013 has managed to pretty effectively wipe out the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, as I said, it's a regional organization, but it was established in Egypt. Egypt is far and away the most populous Arab country, the most, in many ways, even today, remains the most consequential Arab state. And given the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's, this is a very simplistic analogy, but it's in some ways useful to think of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood the way we would have looked at the Soviet Communist Party in a previous era, that it is, in a sense, the supreme guide of all these various branches. And that was certainly true for many years with respect to Hamas. But during the past decade, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood has been thoroughly decimated. I mean, it's, President Morsi died in prison. A number of other leaders have also died in prison. Many more leaders are in prison. Movements
60,000 political prisoners, 60,000.
Yes,
Unbelievable.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the others are either in exile or in hiding. So to your question about where has the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood been during this past month, I think perhaps a more pertinent question is where is the Egyptian, what is the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Well, also, I mean, an important question: where are the where are Hamas's allies? Because its allies, its closest allies, seem to be Hezbollah, Iran, Qatar to some degree. And where are the other Arab countries on this? I mean, granted, they're generally run by, corrupt dictatorships that have their own agendas and agendas with the US empire and so on. But it is a question because throughout Palestinian history, this has always been part of the tragedy of the Palestinians, right? So if you could.
Well, Hamas is routinely presented as a charter member of what's known as the Axis of Resistance. The Axis of Resistance is a coalition whose most important and powerful member is Iran today, and also includes Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi movement in Yemen, Islamic Jihad, a variety of militias in Iraq, and some others in the region. And while Hamas is, in some respects, a member of this coalition, in others it isn't. So if we go back a decade, we see that when the Syria conflict erupted, Hamas had its headquarters in Damascus, and then ended up basically leaving its leadership at the time, left Syria and relocated to Qatar. And as it did so, this also resulted in a rupture in its relations with Iran that lasted for a number of years. There was also an incident where Islamic Jihad, when the war in Yemen erupted, was asked to make a particular statement about the Yemeni conflict, which it refused to do. And all of a sudden, Iran started funding a rival movement in the Gaza Strip. Those relations have been significantly repaired in recent years. I mean, Islamic Jihad never had a rupture the way that Hamas did. It maintained its headquarters in Damascus. It continued to look to Iran for leadership and so on, because it's much closer to that tradition. And it appears that Hezbollah played an important role in repairing these relations, and Hamas has even begun repairing its relations with Syria. And I think a key figure in this entire process has been the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, not of the overall organization, but of its Gaza branch, who is nevertheless, I think, a more consequential and influential figure than the titular head of the organization these days. His name is Yahya Sinwar, who was released from Israeli prison in the 2011 Israeli-Hamas prisoner exchange, and quickly rose to leadership position. And this was at a time, when Hamas's initial response to the Sisi coup in Egypt was to keep referring to the deposed Morsi government as a legitimate government in Egypt, to Sisi as an illegitimate ruler, and so on, which and the Sisi government, for its part, tried to make it look as if Hamas was behind each and every problem in Egypt. Sinwar looked at the map, and at that stage, really the only significant allies that Hamas had were Qatar and Turkey. And Sinwar came to the conclusion, well, Qatar is good for a certain amount of funding and as an alternative headquarters. Some of our leaders can be based in Turkey, but what we really need is to base our relations with regional powers on the basis not of our ideological preferences, but on the basis of our needs and interests. And he worked very hard and ultimately successfully to repair Hamas's relations with Egypt, to repair Hamas's relations with Iran, with Syria. And as a result, Hamas today, I wouldn't call Egypt an ally of Hamas by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a working relationship. And Hamas now enjoys good relations with Iran. It continues to have an alternative headquarters, if you will, in Qatar. So it has a much more diverse set of relationships and alliances in the region than it did a decade ago.
That's really important. Thanks for explaining that, because there is a line of thinking among so-called foreign policy experts or Middle East experts that really wants to accentuate and have accentuated sectarian differences and inflame sectarian differences. And really, you can see, even just from your explanation again, why the Syria war was such a great, wonderful war for the neocons, the kind of the DC lobby, the Israelis. I mean, because it sharpened those and heightened those divisions, and it's just gruesome. But that explanation is really interesting because it shows how practical. I mean, once again, how completely different from ISIS Hamas is, how practical they've been. Right. And Bacconi's book also shows all these numerous instances where, although they will always maintain certain red lines in their posture towards Israel and what they're willing to negotiate and not, they consistently show flexibility in indirect negotiations with Israel over ceasefires, over prisoner exchanges, over other things. And it just seems time and again, you have the inescapable conclusion that Israel then basically breaks every single one of those ceasefires with an assassination attempt. It's like for some reason, they go through the effort of organizing those or agreeing to these various ceasefires or kind of like temporary deals, which do stick, surprisingly. Again, we don't hear much about this. You really have to read. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, if we look at the history, the 2008 Israeli offensive, I mean, if we're talking about mass killings again, the 2008 Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip started when a 6-month Israeli Hamas ceasefire was about to expire.
Right.
Hamas had expressed an interest in extending it, and Israel, I think in large part to remove the stain of defeat from its 2006 war with Lebanon, started the onslaught with a massive air raid against a graduation ceremony for civilian police forces, killing something along the lines of 300 or 350 of them. That happened in the flash of an eye.
Yeah.
In 2012, the conflict erupted when Israel, out of the blue, assassinated Mazen al-Jabari, who was I believe, either the head or deputy head of the military wing of Hamas. And I think this was in revenge for his role in negotiating the prisoner exchange, which had been concluded the year before. And it felt had an open account with them since he managed to free so many
Mhm.
Palestinian prisoners. Now, yes, Hamas is an Islamist movement. Yes, Hamas believes that the entirety of mandatory Palestine is Palestinian territory, and all the rest of it. Yes, like any Palestinian, Hamas would like to see Palestine free from the river to the sea, although of course there are different interpretations of how that freedom would look in substance. They would probably prefer to see an Islamist state. Many others would prefer to see a democratic or binational state. And you can look at the Hamas charter, and of course, its initial iteration had some exceptional,
Yes.
objectionable
Yeah.
passages. Its revised charter less so, but I mean, I think we need to wean ourselves off this idea that every time Hamas needs to take a decision, they kind of go around the table and lay out the charter and start studying to see
Yeah.
what position they should take. There is
Yeah.
a very long history of statements by Hamas leaders that they would essentially accept a two-state settlement. From their point of view, if Israel withdraws from the occupied territories back to the 1967 boundaries, and there's a resolution of the refugee question about which different leaders give different signals, that Hamas would then accept effectively an indefinite truce with Israel. And this is their way of dressing up a peace agreement without having to formally recognize Israel. Now, many people see that as a problem, but if you look at Oslo, the ones who recognized Israel were the formal Palestinian leadership, the PLO. The Fatah movement never recognized Israel.
Right.
It was never asked to recognize Israel, nor any of these other movements. Now, Hamas's official position is that it will not actively work to undermine, that it will accept any agreement with Israel that is either ratified by legitimate Palestinian institutions, for which read a PLO in which we are incorporated rather than excluded, or an agreement that is ratified in a Palestinian referendum. And my reading of that is that it wants others to do the dirty work of negotiating Israel and reaching an agreement with it. And then it can say, well, we're good Palestinians and good Democrats. We will bow to the popular will, but we retain our purity. So sure, you can look at the charter, look at this, look at that. I mean, if you want to exclude someone from being part of the solution, you can always find an excuse. I mean, the U.S. has now sees Israel as a partner for its diplomatic initiatives. Well, the official Likud anthem still says, the River Jordan has two banks. One is ours, and so is the other. So, does that mean Anyway, I think you
I
get
just love that Israel has actual members in its government that are from a party actually called Jewish Power. And yes, they are fascist, straight up, one of which called for nuking Gaza. I mean, talk about partners, but
Irish haters too.
I know. John, you were going to say something?
Oh, yeah. Oh, shoot. Now I forgot.
Well, I'm sorry. I interrupted you. I think we should talk a little bit about the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas and what sort of legitimacy he has, what his relationship is like with Hamas. And I'm sorry I don't know how long you can stick with us. I don't want to keep you forever. Okay, good. Thanks. Because this is a great conversation. I really appreciate it. They obviously, what we talked about in our last episode, where we ended off in our kind of history of Hamas, was Hamas shocked the lunkheads in the Bush administration by sweeping the legislative elections in 2006, which gave it the right to form the government with the prime minister, which was a structure that the U.S. forced on the Palestinian Authority in order to devolve powers away from Arafat, who they didn't like. Now suddenly those powers were going to Hamas. It's like, oh my God, let's switch it around, re-centralize those powers back with Abbas. And then they did this arm and training program with Palestinian Authority and essentially tried to carry out a regime change, which Hamas preempted. Is this right? Sort of preemptively struck in late.
Yeah, I think that's generally accurate. As mentioned previously, in 2006, Hamas participated in Palestinian elections, despite its formal rejection of Oslo Agreement, because it sought to translate its popular support into institutional power, and sought to integrate itself with the Palestinian political system. As in many parliamentary systems, if you look closely at the vote, Hamas did not, in fact, win the popular vote, but it won a veto-proof majority of seats in the parliament because its opponents were so divided, particularly the Fatah movement, which in many constituencies ran multiple rival lists, allowing the Hamas candidate to effortlessly sneak through and grab the seat. Hamas, critics would say that Hamas responded to its electoral victory as if Palestinian history up until that point was irrelevant, whereas its opponents responded to the Hamas victory by saying, actually, it's irrelevant because we've been around for the last 40, 50 years. And I think it's true, both those statements are true, but I think the more important reality is that the Palestinian Authority refused to cede power to Hamas in accordance with the results of those elections. And it's even more relevant that those who were clamoring, most loudly about democracy and elections and all the rest of it in the West were appalled by this election result and refused to accept it. And from the very first moment, actively worked to undermine it. To fast forward, the result came in mid-June of 2007, when Hamas perceived that it was about to be the victim of a coup attempt that was being led by a Palestinian figure named Mohammed Dahlan, who was a darling of Elliot Abrams. And I have to say, General Dayton, who played a fairly nefarious role in the occupied territories during this period, is in my view unfairly made a scapegoat, because if you look back at the relevant documentation, he was warning Washington that Dahlan is damaged goods, and it was Elliot Abrams who insisted that he was the right man for the job. That didn't work out because Hamas launched a preemptive seizure of power, took control of the Gaza Strip, and has been in control of it ever since.
It's amazing that Elliot Abrams just keeps being brought back into government, no matter how many appalling, grotesque failures. It's like they have nobody else they can tap. And it's like, well, call Elliot, bring him in, The
war criminal with 9 lives.
Yeah, I know.
Well, maybe that's his usefulness, we need some dirty work done.
Although he doesn't even do that well. I mean, it's pretty shocking. So about Abbas, though, I mean, it's clear the West and probably Israel want to deal with him. And you're seeing these plans floated around that assume that Israel can even, quote unquote, destroy Hamas. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. I don't know what you think, but assuming they even can, whatever the hell that means, that then they're going to put Abbas's people with UN backing. There's a lot of cockamamie plans going on, in charge of Gaza. And so how is Abbas viewed? I mean, have the kind of political cultures really developed in sort of diverging ways under different authorities in Gaza and West Bank?
Well, they have, but
Yeah.
that's not the main issue. And here I would like to point to what could be an emerging divergence between U.S. and Israeli policy objectives. One reason that Hamas has been able to retain power in the Gaza Strip is that Israel, its hostility to Hamas notwithstanding, has come to the conclusion that keeping the Palestinians divided and fragmented is a more important strategic objective, and that tolerating continued Hamas rule in the Gaza Strip is a price worth paying to keep the West Bank and the Gaza Strip institutionally, politically, and not just geographically divided.
Right.
And in that respect, I think the criticism of Netanyahu that he's bolstering Hamas and so on is vastly exaggerated, because it's not a policy that he invented. It's a policy that has been implemented by all of his predecessors since 2006, 2007, even if he's been in office most of that period. He's basically implementing the policy of the Israeli political leadership and security establishment.
Right.
And to suggest that he's doing this for personal reasons,
Yeah.
that's simply not true. Now, of course, every Israeli leader is coming out of the woodworks claiming that they've been warning against this all along, but they didn't seem to have a problem with it while they thought it was working. So against this background, as you mentioned, I mean, none of this planning, if you will be possible if Israel does not successfully eradicate Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Do they have the means to do this? Yes, they do. The question is, do they have the will and capability to do this in terms of the losses they may well need to incur and so on? I think that's a much more difficult question to answer. Now, the United States would very much like to install Abbas and the Palestinian Authority back in Gaza, because, of course, the operative principle here, as far as U.S. leaders are concerned, is that is their prerogative to choose the Palestinian leadership and not something that Palestinians should be doing. I don't think, Abbas is said to have told Blinken that he won't consider going back to Gaza unless and until there is a comprehensive political resolution of the question of Palestine. I think it goes even beyond that. Abbas, those who know him say there's two things he hates above all else. One is a legacy of Yasser Arafat, and the other is the Gaza Strip, and that he wants absolutely nothing to do with what he views as this very poisonous chalice. But there are two issues to consider here. The first is whether the Palestinian Authority is going to survive this crisis. And I think Blinken probably thought he was doing Abbas a favor yesterday when, after meeting him in Ramallah, he publicly thanked him for preserving quiet and stability, for his role in preserving quiet and stability in the West Bank alongside the Israeli military, which has now killed more Palestinians in the West Bank in the past month than I think it did all of last year. The second question, and Nathan Brown of George Washington University recently had a very perceptive article about this issue in the Carnegie Center for Middle East, in which he said, we're all talking about the day after as if this is kind of a conventional war, which is going to have a conventional ending with conventional follow-up. And that's very unlikely to be the case. And so, any post-conflict, quote unquote, scenario that assumes that on a certain date the guns will fall silent, Israel will withdraw back to the 1967 boundary, and Blinken can come in and install whoever he wants in the Gaza Strip, and that will be celebrated by Palestinians with rice and flowers. No, I don't think it's going to
Well,
work.
that gets at something that Mark and I have observed in many situations. For the first time that I can remember, and obviously there's been a lot of war in Palestine for most of my lifetime, there seems to be a big disjunction between the DNC and its mainstream clients, its mainstream demographic. And the DNC has begun, or Biden or whoever it is, whatever the blob is, seems a little crazy, as in they don't have any sense of the fact that it's not 1967 anymore, that things have changed massively in the US population. I mean, do you get a sense of something strange in the way the US public is viewing this war?
Yeah, I mean, we've never seen pro-Palestine, pro-public. I mean, clearly it's been brewing then for a long time, but we've never seen this. I remember, John, I mean, when we were younger, if you peeped something pro-Palestinian, your career was done. Yeah. I mean, I don't have to tell you, but like, yeah.
No, it's true. And we've seen this, I think, the shift has been particularly dramatic among younger Jewish Americans who, I mean, in contrast to Jewish American youth half a century ago, who were, I think it's fair to say, very solidly pro-Israel. Today, I think it's fair to say that the majority tend to be either indifferent or appalled by any association with Israel. And I think, since you mentioned Biden, I think it's important to recognize that people like Biden and Blinken and McGurk and Sullivan come from a political culture which is incapable of distinguishing between American and Israeli interests. People accuse them of putting Israeli interests above American interests. I think that's completely inaccurate.
Yeah, totally agree.
The real issue is that they see American and Israeli interests as identical. Whatever is good for Israel is good for the United States. Whatever is bad for Israel will reflect negatively on the United States. And that, I think, more than anything else, explains, as you put it, the absolutely exceptionally crazy embrace of Israel by Biden and Blinken and Sullivan and the rest of them this past month. It's gone way beyond anything we've ever seen before.
Mouin, if you wouldn't mind, because we've been talking so much about politics and military strategy and history and so on, but I do think, and so have we, so have John and I, in a sense, that, when we've been talking about this conflict, but I do think it's important to understand, for example, why sentiment among so much of the Democratic base and among younger American Jews and among younger people in the West in general has shifted. I mean, if you could give a sort of description of what life has been like in occupied Gaza and what the Israelis have done, and I know that's a lot to cover, so however short or however you want to do it, but like, it is important. People can never be reminded enough, I think. And if you could sort of explain,
Well, let me perhaps preface my remarks by saying, Israel has been extraordinarily successful over the years as presenting itself, as different things to different people. it was able to present itself as kind of a liberal outpost of democracy, to liberal Democrats, as a fulfillment of biblical promise, to evangelical Christians as an outpost of civilization against barbarism, to the MAGA types and to conservatives and so on. And what I think has happened is that as Israel has become not only an increasingly extremist state, but increasingly incapable of any inhibition about what it is and what it intends to do, and doing it so openly and proudly, it's become much more difficult for it to be all things to all people. Secondly, I think one of Israel's most important resources has always been the solid bipartisan support it has enjoyed in the United States. And Netanyahu, more than anyone else, has sought to identify Israel with a partisan domestic American political agenda. So I think, for some of these people, it doesn't matter what you think about Israel or the Palestinians, but the fact that, Netanyahu is brazenly coming to Congress at the invitation of a Republican speaker to undermine Obama and so on, that matters. People remember these things. And it has more to do with, let's say, partisan politics than any view about what you may think about the realities in the Middle East. I just wanted to start off with those remarks. I mean, as far as reality and the occupied territories, in particular the Gaza Strip, is concerned, let's start with the Gaza Strip. I mean, if you were to go to the Gaza Strip today, assuming you could get in, you can actually find people, and not a few, people in their 30s and 40s who have never left the Gaza Strip. Because they can't get permission to leave, they don't have opportunity. If you were to have gone to the Gaza Strip in the 1980s, you'd be hard pressed to find a 10-year-old who hadn't been to the West Bank or been taken by their parents to their original village or town in what is now Israel and so on. Gaza Strip has effectively been encaged by Israel. I mean, no less than former British Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron described it as the largest open-air prison in the world. And this is someone who considers himself a stalwart friend of Israel. So you can imagine.
Tory. Yeah, a Tory. I know. Yeah.
Yes. And it is Sarah Roy of Harvard University has quite accurately described Israeli policy towards the Gaza Strip not as development or underdevelopment, but de-development, a policy of making any future development impossible. The United Nations, I believe it was UNDP, put out a report a few years ago that Gaza would become unfit for human habitation by 2020. It's now 2023, and this report was issued before the extraordinary destruction we've seen over the past month. It's a population that has been thoroughly dehumanized, thoroughly brutalized, thoroughly impoverished. I mean, we're talking about unemployment levels in the region of 50%, if I'm not mistaken. And every few years, you get these massive bombing campaigns that kill a lot of people, traumatize an entire generation of children. And I think Israel's defense minister expressed the attitude best when he, on the first day of Israel's war, described Palestinians as human animals. That is exactly how Israel sees these people. And that is exactly how it has been treating them for many, many decades. I think an equally objectionable part of this is that he was not only speaking on behalf of Israeli elites, but I think he was accurately expressing the attitude of many Western policy elites towards the Palestinians. I said at the beginning that U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken views Palestinians as irrelevant human scum. And I stand by that characterization because I think, if anything, it's an understatement. His first diplomatic mission to the Middle East was to generate Arab support for the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, for the mass expulsion of Gaza's Palestinians to basically be thrown into the desert, into the Sinai Peninsula. He considered this a serious policy proposal, and he actually thought he could bring Washington's Arab allies on board to cooperate with this. So, human animals, I think, perfectly encapsulates Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, particularly in the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, the situation is somewhat different. And that situation is, I think, characterized by much more regular, if lower intensity, raids and brutalization by the Israeli military, and increasingly by its settler auxiliary militias as well. You've had entire villages depopulated. Basically, Israel has grabbed so much of the land in the West Bank that Palestinians now are cooped up in these cantons, ghettos, Bantustans, whatever you want to call them, with no prospect of a meaningful and dignified future. And when you hear leaders like Biden and Blinken or their European counterparts, talking about peace process, two-state settlements, these are all diversionary charades. Mm-hmm. They don't mean a word of it. And because they don't mean a word of it, it has become, for all intents and purposes, impossible to implement in practice. I mean, you can't advocate for something and then systematically for decades look the other way when one party does everything within its power to prevent that aspiration from becoming a reality. I mean, it's like, Blinken now talking about humanitarian aid for the Gaza Strip. It's a diversionary charade. You can't supply Israel with unlimited weaponry, state that you will place no restrictions on how it uses those weapons, block any attempt to promote a ceasefire, and then expect to be taken seriously when you start talking about, a thimbleful of water here, a loaf of bread there, and a 3-hour humanitarian pause there.
Yeah, it seems to me sort of like when some police goons or whatever are torturing somebody, and then they bring in the doctor to give them a shot to wake them up again. Like that's
that's a very good analogy, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's grim. And then of course now the situation in Gaza is so much more dire because they're not letting fuel in. The people are starting to have to turn to unhealthy water. They're having chicken pox outbreaks and thousands of people trapped under rubble. I mean, it's
well, I was speaking about, sorry to interrupt you. I was speaking about the general situation.
Yes.
About the situation today.
Yes.
Israel was very clear at the very outset, from the president of that state on down, that they make no distinction between the civilian population and Palestinian combatants, that they consider the entire society a legitimate target, and that and that they see no distinction. What they did already on October 7th, they and bear in mind the full control Israel has over this territory. They shut off the fuel supply, they shut off the electricity supply, they shut off the water supply, they shut off any medicines from going on. Now, anyone familiar with armed conflict knows that the last people that are going to be affected by any of these measures are military groups or militant groups or whatever you want to call them. It is a war against a society, not against an organization. And the tragedy here is that, once you shut off everything but the oxygen, it takes time, for people to start dying of hunger, dying of disease, dying from lack of medication. And that's why it's continuing. And those who now claim that, we're trying to get a humanitarian policy, they know exactly what's going on and they support what's going on. One thing this crisis has revealed is how utterly dependent Israel is on the United States for military, political, and diplomatic support. And Biden wouldn't even need to make a phone call to Netanyahu to restore any of these things. But he has chosen not to because, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about people who are incapable of distinguishing between US and Israeli interests, and they fear that an Israeli failure will reflect poorly on the US geopolitically. And they want this to succeed, and therefore they're giving these inhumane and dehumanizing measures the time they need to begin working.
Wow, I think
I think we can
better
wrap it up
end.
here. Yeah. I mean, it's really depressing as hell. And but I do think the only, I don't know, I'd hate to say it's a good thing, but the only sort of light in all this is seeing how many people have come out, in support of Palestine. As for olders like us, it's mind-blowing. It must be for you too.
It's extraordinary. It could not happen in the 20th century.
No, and as you mentioned, I grew up in the Netherlands, and when I was growing up there, and this was true for Europe in general, governments tended to have a more forward-looking position towards this issue than public opinion. It's now the exact opposite. And I will say that I think in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, public opinion probably has more of an influence on policy than in a country like the United States, where, okay, you have elections, but politics is basically owned by corporations and lobbies. So I, full of respect and admiration, full respect and admiration for those demonstrating. But I think probably demonstrators in Europe will be able to have impact more quickly than in the United States.
Yeah, that's very well put. Okay, thank you. I think we can wrap it up now. Thank you so much, Mouin. This has been a great interview. I think our subscribers will be really appreciative of it, and hopefully we can get you on again sometime as well.
Thank you very much for having me. I very much enjoyed the opportunity to speak with you as well. Thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, Brendan, now we have to figure out how to close this out. You can go, Mouin.
Okay, thank you.
We'll figure this out. Thanks.
All right. Will you be able to send me?
I will. Yes.
Thanks again.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Brendan, I think what I'm going to do, I guess everyone's listening to this, I guess we would just click leave, right, Brendan?
Yeah, I'm going to turn off the live feed. Yeah.
Okay, just turn off the live feed.
Yeah, you can leave.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
All right, bye.